One of my favorite artists is the 17th century Italian painter Caravaggio, and during the span of his lifetime, he painted a number of biblical scenes. I've always been impressed with the way that he captures the various scenes and brings these biblical passages to new life because of the details that he inserts into his painting. Our late Holy Father, Pope Francis himself, often said that one of his favorite paintings was that of Caravaggio's depiction of St. Matthew's call. And it is a magnificent painting. But the one that has always captured my attention is Caravaggio's painting of this evening's gospel, the encounter between Jesus and Thomas the week after the resurrection. We know the story well, not only because we have just heard it proclaimed in our gospel, but there is often something that resonates within us when we think and hear about St. Thomas. Sadly, oftentimes, it's because of today's gospel that Thomas gets the nickname Doubting Thomas, and it has stayed with him throughout the centuries. But I think oftentimes St. Thomas gets a bum rap with this nickname. It's not like the other apostles during their earthly lifetime never missed the mark. And yet, Thomas is the only one that gets a nickname that sticks with him. Notice that we don't give Judas the nickname Sellout Judas, nor do we give St. Peter the nickname Denying Peter. But somehow Thomas is known forever in history by this one moment that he denies the claim from the other apostles that they have seen the risen Lord on that first Easter Sunday night. In this evening's gospel, we in fact hear not one, but two of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus during the Easter season. The first at the beginning of our gospel happens late on that first Easter night when all of the apostles, except Thomas, are gathered in the upper room. We hear that they are huddled in fear because of what the authorities might do to them. They think that what had happened to Jesus might well happen to them, and therefore they are afraid. And yet, while they are locked in this upper room, St. John in our gospel tells us that the risen Christ appears before them and he reveals himself to them. And all of a sudden, these apostles that were not only filled with this sense of fear and trepidation, but sorrow and sadness because their friend had died, are now filled with new life and joy. But the problem is, for some reason, Thomas is not with them that night in the upper room. And when he returns later that evening and is told the news that Jesus has risen and has appeared before them, we hear that Thomas is filled with doubts. But I think it's important for us to be honest with ourselves. If we were in Thomas's shoes, how would we feel hearing this news by our friends that Jesus is risen? Thomas had seen what had happened to Jesus in the garden. He had witnessed what had happened on Calvary. He had been there when they placed the body in the empty tomb for burial. And now, 3 days later, he is being told that Jesus is not dead and risen. And so Thomas's sense of doubt is something that I think is natural to all of us. Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe. Given that all that Thomas and the apostles had experienced in these past 72 hours, I think doubt is reasonable. And so Thomas refuses to believe in the good news until he can see for himself. And it is interesting that it takes an entire week before he is able to see and believe. For at the end of our gospel this evening, we hear of this second post-resurrection appearance of Jesus a whole week later. Once again, the apostles are in the upper room, but this time we hear nothing about their fear of the authorities. And this time, Thomas is also with them. And suddenly, miraculously, we hear that Jesus appears in their midst. He already knows the doubts that Thomas had, and he wants to be able to strengthen Thomas so that he might come to believe. But notice that when Jesus has his encounter with Thomas, this one-on-one a week later, that Jesus doesn't mock Thomas. He doesn't condemn him for his lack of faith or for his questions or his doubts, but instead in Jesus' gentleness, in his compassion, in his mercy, he wants to be able to help Thomas to come to know and believe. He wants to take away his doubts so that Thomas can be filled with the resurrected Jesus' peace and newness of life. And this is where I think Caravaggio does such a marvelous job in depicting this scene and helping us to appreciate what is happening. In the painting, Jesus is in the center of the room. We see the look of shock on Thomas's face. And with one hand, Jesus opening his cloak to show Thomas the wounds. And with the other hand, he is holding Thomas's hand, guiding them to his wounds, as Thomas has declared earlier that he wanted to put his fingers in those wounds. In other words, Jesus was taking Thomas where he was at, with his questions, with his queries, with his doubts, and helping Thomas to come to the fullness of the truth. And Jesus does this with such tenderness, not only in the depiction of the painting, but moreover with Thomas leading him personally, individually, to a deeper sense of faith. And we know that it works because Thomas, upon seeing Jesus and his wounds, doesn't need any further proof. He doesn't need to put his hands in the wounds, but instead Thomas sees and believes. And then he is able to make that declaration of faith, my Lord and my God. As Thomas gazes upon Jesus, he is able to make that great declaration of faith, my Lord and my God. And it's interesting that in the painting, Caravaggio also depicts two of the other apostles closely watching all of this, and they have a curious look on their face. It is almost as if Caravaggio knew intuitively that these apostles also had doubts, but were afraid to voice them. But they wanted to see and to make sure that it was really Jesus that was risen from the dead. I think what both tonight's gospel and Caravaggio's painting remind us that, like Thomas and even those two other apostles in the painting, it is okay for us in the midst of our life journey to have doubts, to have questions, to have queries about faith and life itself. That questions and doubts are not a denial of faith, but they are an opportunity for us to be able to grow and to expand. It is an opportunity for God in his tenderness and his mercy to reach out to us, to help us so that we might be able, like Thomas, to declare, my Lord and my God. A priest, a friend of mine, often says that Jesus meets us in the messiness of our lives. This is what he did to Thomas on that second Sunday of Easter, and what he does for us day in and day out. Jesus meets us in the messiness of our lives and helps us to be able to understand like Thomas, so that our faith can be not only strengthened, but it can be renewed, so that we too can say, my Lord and my God. That's why as we gather tonight on this second Sunday of Easter, thanks to St. John Paul the Great, we celebrate with the church tonight Divine Mercy Sunday. It is an opportunity for us to be immersed in the great and tender mercy of our God, who meets us in the messiness of our lives, who embraces us in the midst of our doubts and our questions, who gently and lovingly and with great mercy helps us to find the way. And so, like Saint Faustina, we are invited to be able to discover in our lives how it is that we can trust in Jesus. Saint Faustina's great words, "Jesus, I trust in you." This is what Saint Thomas and the other apostles needed to learn. And this is what the early church needed to learn. And this is what we ourselves, some 2,000 years later, need to be able to learn and relearn. That in the midst of our questions, in the midst of our queries, in the midst of our doubts, we too are called to profess, "Jesus, I trust in you." And why? Because, like St. Thomas, we have come to know and to believe that Jesus is my Lord and my God. And so this week, when we experience those questions, those queries, those doubts, when we seem to be overwhelmed by the darkness and the chaos that exists sometimes in our lives and certainly in our world, let us cry out like Saint Faustina, "Jesus, I trust in you." And when we are able to trust in Jesus, when we are able to recognize him as our Lord and our God, then, like our psalmist today, we are able to give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever.